Hello everybody and welcome back to another Captain's Academy episode, and today I'm going to explain to you how you can use this armor viewer that's coming to World of Warships to your advantage. Now this armor viewer is incredibly useful as long as you understand the mechanics behind armor angling and overmatch mechanics and things like that. You can really start to understand why your ship is vulnerable, how it's vulnerable, etc, etc, etc. So let's first look at one of the sort of questions that people have, which is why is it that the Cleveland happens to be incredibly difficult to citadel, but ships like the Omaha and the Pensacola and so on and so forth are rather easy to citadel. And one of the first things you can do with the armor viewer is disable everything else except for this very last option. And this very last option shows you the ship's vital components, and that is the citadel area. Take a look at the Omaha, and the first thing you notice is that a huge chunk of its citadel sits above the water. So if you're in an Omaha and you show your broadside to somebody, you typically get erased from existence because you have this humongous citadel that sits very high off the water. Now let's take a look at a different ship, and let's take a look at the Pensacola. And you'll notice that with the Pensacola, if you're looking at the citadels, that there's still a part of it that sits outside of the water. It's a little bit less than that of the Omaha. It's not as drastically out of the water, but there's still a nice, pretty comfortable strip to hit that's going to be above water. Not only that though, but if you take a look at the Pensacola, you'll notice that there is a nice big citadel area that extends all the way from the fore turrets all the way to the aft turrets. And so there's this huge citadel area to hit, and that's another one of the reasons why the Pensacola tends to be citadeled rather easily. But now let's take a look at the Cleveland, and you'll see something very different. The Cleveland has a notoriously hard to hit citadel, and here's the reason why. In the past we used to think that the citadel used to be split underneath the funnels. They're not. They're actually one big unit, but take a look at where the citadel is placed. For the citadel area, for the guns and everything, it's essentially all underwater. Only around the engine area is there a tiny little strip, just a very small strip that's above water. And so typically in game where you have a little bit of pitch for your ship, this makes the Cleveland incredibly difficult to citadel. Sure, you can still do it, but it's not an easy ship to do it against. And so Clevelands, as most of you probably are aware, are much more resistant to damage, even to battleship shells, compared to the Pensacola or the Omaha. The armor viewer also helps to explain the tier 10 battleship issues, especially the Montana versus the Yamato, and of course how the new tier 10 German battleship plays into the equation. So most people, if they've ever played a Montana or played against a Montana in a Yamato, you know that the Montana tends to be rather easy to take lots of penetration damage, tends to be easy to get penetration damage. And up close, you tend to be able to get citadels even if the Montana is bow on. Well, the armor viewer helps explain why. First of all, let's take a look at the citadel area, and you'll notice that on the side there's 409mm of belt armor. And this piece of belt armor covers the area above the waterline and a little bit below the waterline. So typically speaking, if a Montana is angled like this, and you shoot at its side, it generally has a tendency of bouncing your shells. However, you'll notice that below this piece of armor, there's another piece of armor. So if you manage to get a hit further down, and let's say the Montana is turning and it's showing a little bit more of that red, if you hit further down, there's a citadel armor that's only 259mm thick. Generally speaking, Montanas, if you get shells that go underwater hit there, or you tend to be turning and you're exposing that area, you tend to get citadeled relatively easily. But what about the bow? Montana drivers, when they go bow in, they tend to take citadel hits from Yamatos, especially up close, and there's a good reason why. Let's take a look at the bow armor first, and you'll have an idea why in a second. Take a look at the bow armor, 32mm, and if you understand the overmatch mechanic, and if you don't, make sure to check out the overmatch mechanic video. The ratio is 14.3, right? So 32 times 14.3, and it's not enough to resist Yamato's 460mm guns. The overmatch ratio dictates that if you're bow in to a Yamato, it will pen your bow. And so once you pen the bow, you just have to go through this flat piece of armor here. Yes, it's 457mm thick, and the lower one's 432mm thick, but against the Yamato's amazing penetration, especially up close, it'll just go through your bow and go through that piece of armor, and you will take those frontal citadels. But that's not the Montana's only problem. The Montana also has a lot of problems with hits to its deck, and you'll take loads of penetration damage no matter what you do. And there's a reason for that too. If you take a look at the armored deck of the Montana, you'll notice that the deck armor is 29 millimeters thick. Yes, the Montana has another layer of deck armor underneath it, so if you take this layer away, you'll see that it does have a Citadel deck that's 150 millimeters, and while that might prevent Citadel hits coming in from above, it won't stop the penetrating hits, especially from Yamatos. Because 29 millimeters, while it is enough to prevent overmatch from 406 millimeter guns, so let's say you're in Montana, and let's say another Montana shooting at you, and it hits your deck, it won't overmatch. However, if you take hits from guns larger than 414.7 millimeters, that's the Yamato's 460 millimeter guns, as well as the 420 millimeter guns on the German Tier 10 battleship. All of a sudden, that gun choice is starting to look a lot more interesting, by the way. You're going to be able to get penetration hits on a Montana's deck armor because you're going to be able to overmatch it. The Montana against itself, sadly, is out of luck. And so this armor viewer allows you very quickly, especially if you understand the mechanics of how armor and things work, to understand why the Montana just struggles so badly against ships like the Yamato, or ships like the new German Tier 10 if they're armed with the 420 millimeter guns. Alright, so let's take a look at a different ship now, because you're probably wondering what is superior about the Yamato. So let's take a look at the Yamato's armor, and you'll immediately see that there's quite a difference. Alright, so the Yamato's armor is a little bit more complicated than the Montana's. Montana's armor tends to be pretty square, while the Yamato's has a lot of sort of interesting angle bits. Alright, first up, let's take a look at the big piece of belt armor. 410 millimeters thick, a nice big piece, goes comfortably underwater and extends comfortably above water as well. So if a Yamato is angled to you like this and you shoot at its side, you're pretty much guaranteed to do nothing but bounce. However, if you're at this kind of angle, the Yamato does have a weakness, which is this forward section here. It does present a somewhat flat bit right here on the cheeks. So if you're at this kind of angle and you've got a shot, you can try to place it under these forward turrets into this piece of armor. However, this armor isn't fully flat. If you actually look at it, let's see if I can get it here, it is actually sloped in a downwards manner as well, which does increase the armor protection a little bit. However, Yamato, with its amazing penetrating guns, you should, at least up close, be able to even overcome that armor angling and get Citadel hits. However, if you're dealing with ships like a Montana, or you're dealing with ships like the German Tier 10 with the 406 or 420 millimeter guns, you're generally pretty safe, and it's also the reason why a lot of Yamato captains like to just sit bow on. 32 millimeters of bow armor, you cannot overmatch this with 406 or 420 millimeter guns. Only another Yamato can overmatch bow, and that's the reason why Yamatos, when they go bow to bow, they'll shoot at each other, do lots of penetrating damage, and occasionally, if they hit the right places on this kind of armor and penetrate it, they will be able to get citadels as well from the front. Yamato armor, at least when it comes to the citadel protection, is pretty damn good, and very, very hard to deal with if you're in anything but another Yamato. But then we have to talk about the deck protection. The Montana, like I mentioned earlier, with its 29mm upper deck armor, gets overmatched by 420mm guns of the German Tier 10, gets overmatched by the Yamato's 460mm guns. The Yamato, on the other hand, its deck protection is really good. First of all, you have this piece of Citadel deck armor, which is 200mm thick, so pretty much nothing's going to get through that. But on top of that, and this is where things get interesting, the Yamato has this piece of deck armor that's 57mm thick. And this is why when you shoot at a bow-on Yamato that's looking at you like this, when you even land shells here, you struggle to actually do lots of penetration damage. And so Yamato, very, very well protected compared to the Montana, which with its 29mm of deck armor up here, just takes penetration hits for days. But now let's take a look at the new German Tier 10 battleship, and it is kind of interesting. And let's take a look at the reasons why. First of all, let's look at the Citadel protection. The first thing you notice about the German ship is, whoa, that Citadel protection is pretty low in the water. It's a very, very small little bit here, and of course on the inside it's the Citadel torpedo bulkhead. But it doesn't really seem to have a very thick amount of armor on the outside, and that's because it's covered with this casement armor piece. You'll see here that this casement armor has armor belt that's 380 millimeters thick, which again means if you're angled, good luck with it. But second, take a look at this unique shape here. Right around, ooh, can't even see, I can't get that piece. Oh, here it is. This one. See that? That piece over here is the turtleback. That's 150 millimeters of armor that's angled that way, right? And so up close, if you have a ship that's shooting you up close and it's coming in with a flat shell, it'll hit that belt armor. If it can penetrate that, it still has to deal with that piece of angled turtleback armor. And most likely what happens after that is the shell will bounce, and then what you'll end up getting is nothing more than penetration damage. So the German Tier 10 battleship, very, very different. If it gives you that angled side, you're not likely to get much except for penetrating hits. Still, I mean, even then, when you look at the deck armor, it's still 50 millimeters as well. So if the German Tier 10 battleship, and it doesn't really have to go bow on in much the way that the Yamato does, it can do a little bit more of this angled stuff. And the reason why it can do a little bit more of this angling stuff is because it's got these two pieces of armor here. Here, sort of where you would think that, okay, it's giving me a flat area under the turrets, maybe I can shoot in there, kind of like the way I can do against a Yamato. It's 120 millimeters, and if it's angled, that piece of armor is going to be very, very hard to penetrate. And then, even if you get through that piece of armor, well, then you take a look at what's behind it, and that Citadel piece, it's not very thick, but hitting it might not be that easy, right? So that piece makes it frustrating. And then, of course, you have this area, where on both the Montana and the Yamato, this is only 32 millimeters and can get overmatched by 460 millimeter guns. The German Tier 10, this piece is 60 millimeters thick. So if you're bow in and they're hitting these two, not even a Yamato can overmatch this piece of armor. The Yamato can overmatch this piece of armor here, which is 32 millimeters thick, and of course this piece up top, but hitting a tiny piece of armor like that with battleship dispersion is not an easy thing to do. So the German Tier 10 battleship is one very, very well protected ship against shell fire. But, of course, its huge size does make it vulnerable to torpedoes and airplanes. Another interesting series of ships to look at is the ships at Tier 6, the Tier 6 battleships. So, let's take a look at the New Mexico for a second. Because the New Mexico, if you've played her, you know that she has an interesting weakness, which is that her turrets seem to get knocked out quite easily. And there's good reason for why that happens. Alright, so take a look at the New Mexico. Outside here, near the gun turrets, you have 25 millimeters of armor. It's not a lot of armor. But once you take that away, take a look at, especially the number 2 turret. Look at how high that turret is and how much barbette armor there is exposed. So if you're in another battleship and you're able to get through that 25 millimeters of armor, and then you can hit this, you can quite easily knock out turrets. And typically when you play New Mexico, you know that like the number 2 turret is one of the easy ones to get knocked out. And so once you look at the armor viewer, you kind of know why. Wow, there's a lot of armor that's actually exposed. It's not that difficult to hit. Another ship to look at would be, let's say, the Bayern. Now, the new German battleship, for those of you who've run into it, you probably realize that, boy, this battleship does not seem easy to Citadel. Like, yes, it'll take some penetration damage, but oh my goodness, why is it so hard to Citadel? Well, let's take a look. Let's take a look and you'll see why. Look at where the Citadel is. It's completely underwater. That Citadel is just near impossible to hit unless the Bayern is turning really hard and exposing that side because it's showing that little bit of red. That might be the only chance you're really going to get to penetrating that. Not only is it completely underwater and incredibly difficult to hit, then on top of it, it's got turtleback armor. So yeah, this German battleship, for those of you who run into it, will find to be incredibly frustrating to play against because you're not really going to be able to Citadel it. So now that we've sort of covered a couple of ships and generally how to use the armor viewer, let's take a look at one other thing, because the one other line that we can see right now that hasn't been released is actually the British cruisers, and I wonder how their armor protection is. And so I actually looked at their Tier 10. The first thing I noticed about the Tier 10 is God help any British cruiser player who shows a broadside, because here's the reason why. This is the Minotaur, the tier 10 British cruiser. Take a look at that piece of Citadel armor. Oh my goodness. That reminds me of the Pensacola. Look at how much of that is sticking out of the water. Oh dear. I'm pretty sure that if you're in a British tier 10 light cruiser, or the tier 9, because I think the tier 9, yep, look at that. You're going to get Citadel'd for days if you show a broadside. I mean, these things look like they're going to give really easy Citadels if they ever show a broadside. I mean, and if you look at all the other stuff on top of it, doesn't look like they're that well protected at all. I mean, these are light cruisers, but oh boy, that broadside is going to wreck them. And it's actually going to be, I think, a very, very difficult thing for British cruiser players to potentially maybe adapt to, because if you look at the Edinburgh, look at how far that Citadel area sort of drops. I mean, it's very, very much closer to the waterline. And so, British cruiser players, possibly tier 6, yep, oh, actually, maybe not tier 6. Actually, yep, nope, tier 6 is okay. Tier 6 isn't too bad. But, like, once you get to tier 7, they might actually find that their ships aren't too bad. They might be like, oh, you know, like, I don't take Citadels that badly, you know, especially when you get tier 8. Hey, you know, my ship is pretty durable. And then it's like tier 9 and 10, it's like Citadel all the time. Because that Citadel area is just huge and it's way above the water. Reminds me a lot, actually, of this particular US cruiser, too. Take a look at that. See? It kind of reminds me of the Omaha. So anyways, folks, this is a bit of a preview of the armor viewer that's coming in patch 0.5.11 that's currently on the public test. But when this particular feature comes to the actual live server, I hope this video is going to be helpful for you, as you're going to be able to look at your armor and hopefully figure out where your strengths and your weaknesses are going to be. Anyways, folks, if you have any questions about the armor viewer, do let me know in the comment section below. Aside from all that, take care, have a good one, and I'll talk to all of you again soon.